know what's funny? The other day I left YouTube running and I went off and I did fuck knows what at work. And that shit went on a magical journey through all of my old videos. And when I got back to watching the shit, the video that popped up was this one. Nothing like a good controversial title to get people all worked up. And no, I will not be ranting about religion and politics in this video. Although, you know that makes for a good rant on a question and answer session now. But what the fuck does any of this have to do with Bungie? Now I'll get into that in a second. But the main thing to understand is the concept first. The concept is actually fairly simple. Religion should not influence politics and politics should not influence religion. Unfortunately, the two go hand in hand in the United States, and usually one starts to influence the other. The main problem is when one religion starts to be favored over the other religions, that influences political issues, and that's the main problem. But again, this isn't a rant on those issues, but the basis for the concept. Because in Destiny, we have two defined areas, the Crucible and everything else. Player versus player against player versus environment, which is essentially you against the computer or the AI. Bungie wanted to create this game that meshed the two concepts together. You could seamlessly take your campaign items into the Crucible and vice versa. You could beat the raid on hard and bring the most powerful weapon into the Crucible because the castration system is in effect. And this couldn't have been the worst possible idea. Holy shit! Man, I didn't even tell the YouTube owner to go fuck himself in that video. Damn. Now, here's the funny thing about that video, which I did in December of 2014 as part of my Blueprint series on how to fix Destiny 1. And yes, motherfucker, now I feel old after saying that shit. And it's funny because I feel like that's a series that I would seriously consider doing for Destiny 2, but overall, I think this game is a lost cause. I don't think this game needs fixes and band-aids. It needs a giant fucking overhaul. One day I'll go over that. However, I want to focus on the video that was presented. Destiny's ability to separate PvE and PvP, the separation of church and state as I called it, is still a problem to this day. You have to consider the Crucible the church and the Sandbox the state. 3 years ago when I made that video, Destiny 1 was struggling. The Dark Below just released to absolutely awful reviews. The game itself was in a shitty state because it launched with a whole bunch of problems that Bungie really didn't know how to fix. That shit should sound familiar because the game is in the exact predicament now, even more fucked up than the first game. At least with Destiny 1, it was new. They were learning. They had fans offering all kinds of feedback, what the issues were with the new franchise. Now, 3 years later, we're telling them the same shit, the same fucking problems too, in addition to all the new issues they're creating for themselves. Now, over the past 5 months, players have voiced their frustration with things that are missing, things that have changed, basically shit Bungie fucked up on. Yes, they offered up their roadmap for future fixes and whatnot, but that roadmap doesn't address the game's biggest problems. It puts some band-aids on some things, it doesn't really add new content, but when you look at the list of things that players have been asked to be changed, the majority of these issues, not all of them, but the overall majority of these issues go back to Destiny 1's main problem, no separation of church and state. The fact that the Crucible and the Sandbox are still directly tied to one another. This is what leads to Bungie making choices that they made in Destiny 2, and the overwhelming majority of these choices were made out of pure fucking laziness. The overwhelming majority of these problems stem from Bungie being lazy about dealing with the Crucible, or as my comparison goes, the church side of the argument. Usually in cases of church versus state, the overwhelming majority of cases are the church pushing their positions into politics, and the minority of cases are the other way around. Either way, focusing on Destiny, just look at the list of mistakes that are tied to this. Players want random rolls on guns like we had in Destiny 1. The reason why we don't have this is because certain rolls could lead to those god-level weapons. And where does this affect the players the most? The Crucible. The Cabal don't give a shit what gun just popped off Gary's head. But players care about what's killing them in the Crucible. You get killed by a gun that landed an amazing roll, and you can't land that gun because of RNG luck. This was removed because Bungie didn't feel like balancing the Crucible forever. Movement speed. We are much slower in Destiny 2 than we are in Destiny 1 because, again, the Crucible. Highly skilled players use speed and movement to their advantage in the Crucible, and slowing down players was Bungie's way of balancing the field in the Crucible. They wanted to bring some of those high-skilled layers back to the pack so that there wasn't such a separation between the high-level tier players and the average-level tier players. It didn't mean shit in PvE, it just affected the Crucible. Exotic weapons and armor do not feel exotic. Aside from a few decent ones like the Colony, Merciless, Orpheus Rig, Skull of Ahamkara, and some others, there aren't many exotics that outweigh legendary weapons and armor, and part of that was to avoid creating another Gjallarhorn that dominated Destiny 1. Obviously, the Gjallarhorn dominated PvE, but the Thorn and the Last Word dominated year one of Trials. They created generic and bland guns in Destiny 2 so that they wouldn't have to worry about people wanting a specific gun and only using that gun. Meanwhile, the idea failed, because now the majority of shit that people use is Better Devils, Nameless Midnight, Uriel's Gift, and either Curtain Call or Sins of the Past, and obviously the Colony. So essentially what they tried to do was to make these exotics generic, and they succeeded, because now nobody wants to actually use these guns. The two primary gun system was also introduced because in Destiny 1, special weapons ruled the Crucible. Between shotguns, then snipers, eventually it was sidearms. Once they removed all the ammo, it was a giant fuckfest. So Bungie's resort was to give people two primary weapons, moving all the powerful hitting shit into one category. For PvP, it turned the Crucible into a slow primary gunfight mess. For PvE, it basically made shotguns and snipers useless compared to rockets and swords. Had PvE and PvP been separate from the beginning, this wouldn't be an issue. This leads into the time to kill issue that players have in the Crucible. It's certainly slower in Destiny 2 than it was in Destiny 1. Power recharge speeds are far slower, which frustrates players. We've gone from 30 seconds to recharge a grenade to now a minute and 30 seconds. Bungie wanted the Crucible to focus more on gunfights, which would be fine if the guns weren't just solely limited down to those three very good options and a whole bunch of other weapons that are not as good as those three. Had PvE and PvP been separate, this wouldn't be a concern. It would be an issue, but it would be a balance concern instead of a game mechanic concern. The skill tree was also affected by this. We went from multiple choices across multiple columns to basically two skill trees. Speed, recovery, and health were taken out of the skill trees, and now they're placed onto our armor pieces, while all of our choices in setting up our characters are limited to just basically two choices. The one semi-RPG element of the game was removed. For what? Because people in the Crucible would use certain skill nodes to make incredibly powerful characters. Bungie couldn't have that, so they removed our choice and they gave us setups which limited the freedom of the choice that we have now. Again, separately, PvP and PvE could have removed this problem. And the final piece of the puzzle in Destiny 2 is the power level. Has absolutely no use in this game. None. Aside from some bullet sponge enemies and maybe like the prestige modes like Nightfall and the Raid, we don't have power level advantages activated in anything in the Crucible. Fine. Why have it in the first place? Why bother needing it at all in the game if it's not utilized in the first place? That right there shows there's a disconnect between PvE and PvP in Destiny 2, and it has always been that way since the beginning, since Destiny 1. That's just some of the key parts of the game that players are frustrated with right now, and each one of those items is tied to the core problems of Destiny. Player versus environment and player versus player are eternally linked to one another. Destiny 2 has plenty of other issues like the token system, Eververse rewards, the limited reasons to run content like strikes or lost sectors. Those are content issues. But the gameplay and mechanical issues have been a problem since Destiny 1. When Bungie initially announced Destiny 2, and they gave some brief info about the game, one of the biggest questions fans asked was whether or not PvE and PvP are again tied to one another. And again, they confirmed it would be. The player base groans, but they hoped that they would have at least learned some lessons from this from the last time. Ultimately, they didn't. They didn't take any of our advice from 3 years of Destiny 1. Clearly didn't steal any of my ideas from the Blueprint series. Fuckers, man, that could have been an awesome lawsuit that I would have won. I want a shitload of money, man. But the mess that Destiny 2 is in right now is partially because they didn't learn from the biggest mistake of Destiny 1. The end of my Blueprint video gave a suggestion that I offered 3 years ago on how to separate. And you know what? It's still a valid idea that could be used to this date. Basically, it said, give weapons in the environment and the Crucible properties and stats separate from one another. They've already partially shown that they can improve one part of a gun for against enemies, headshots against the environment, compared to the Crucible, well, okay, let's just tone down shotguns in just the Crucible against other players. So they can do it. It's just for some reason they haven't gone the full step and made it a full different portion of the game. Will it take more work and effort on Bungie's part? Absolutely, but I think fans are starting to realize that Bungie isn't looking into putting maximum effort into the game. They put minimal effort into the game, and then maximum effort into the next sale that they need to make. Let's brainstorm a fantastic idea and then scale it back to what we think we can achieve when Activision comes rolling around to collect money. You know, some of the main changes this game is stating it will go through are adding things that Destiny 1 had, like strike-specific loot, the ability to choose your Crucible game mode, but until the game separates the Crucible from from the sandbox. It's not going to matter what portions you take back that were in Destiny 1 at this point, because the key piece that you did take over is what's causing these issues right now. Destiny is always going to be stuck in the same hamster wheel of balance and player complaints as long as you keep PvE and PvP intrinsically tied to one another. Until you remove that link, until you make them completely separate, all of these patches, all of these band-aids, even if you roll out fantastic content in the future, which I really don't think you're going to do, the core problem that has plagued Destiny 1 is still plaguing Destiny 2. And all the changes that you made in response to these things being tied together in Destiny 1 just made the game even more frustrating in Destiny 2. You have to remove the link. They have to be treated separately at this point. There is no other option if you want this game to continue going forward, and if you want to make fans happy. Every one of these changes that fans have wanted are tied to the fact that PvE and PvP should be separate. Anyways, who wants to talk about the separation of church and state and politics? No, we ain't gonna do that shit now. So as always, rate, comment, subscribe, and all that good shit, and I'll see you guys in the next video.